Thanks to those that have already joined. I'll just looking at attendee numbers and I'll just wait for a few minutes so that number's still going up. So just wait for that number to level off a little bit and then we'll begin. Okay, I think we're probably there. So I'll just begin by saying welcome and thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar, which is to walk through the stage 1 process for our funding for our long form publications to support the open access policy. My name is Sarah Ball, and I'm joined by my colleagues Tahir and Emma, so I'll just let them introduce themselves. So Tahir.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Tahir Zaidi, and I'm a Senior Strategy Advisor in the Open Research Team at UKRI, and I work on the implementation of the Open Access Policy.
And Emma.
Hi, everyone. My name's Emma Devine, and I'm a Senior Strategy Advisor in the Open Research Team, and I've been working on the implementation of the funding for long-form outputs.
Thank you. So this webinar is actually one of two, so the second of 2 webinars that we've been holding for research organisations for staff that manage open access to share with you the form for the stage 1 registration process. This form has been created so that you can register outputs with UKRI and gain an indication that an output is, from the information that you have provided, eligible for support from the UKRI's ring-fence fund for long-form publications. So this webinar is not intended to provide a general information or updates about the long-form policy, and we did actually hold a dedicated webinar for that on the 8th of November, and the recording for that from that webinar and also answers to any unanswered questions is now available on our website. So please do take a look if you've not already seen that. So this webinar will be recorded and published on our website. So hopefully it is a useful resource for people undertaking this process moving forward. We also have a Q&A. So as you go along, if there are questions that come to you, please add these to the Q&A function. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end, but also if there are any unanswered questions from that, those will also be published. So if we move to the agenda for the event, Emma, can you move the slides on? I'm not sure if I... Thank you very much. So we will have just a few slides for background and introduction, and then we'll move on to the demonstration of the citizen space process. Then we'll have a Q&A session, as I say, and then next steps and close. So we're thinking that we'll need around about an hour for this webinar. It might sort of finish just after 3 o'clock. We can see how the question and answers go. We might be a little bit longer if needed as well. So if we move to the next slide then, please, Emma. So just to say briefly on the open access policy for long form publications, so that policy goes live on the 1st of January next year. And that means that any book chapters, monographs, edited collections that acknowledge UKRI funding must be made available open access within 12 months of publication, and any Creative Commons license is permitted. The policy recognises 2 routes that this can be achieved. So that's the version of record on the publisher's website or a publishing platform within 12 months, or the author's accepted manuscript in an institutional or subject repository. Next slide, please. Oh, I think there's a previous one. And this is just to say, in terms of implementing our policy, so from the 1st of January next year, we're taking a phased approach to that. So where we do expect research organisations to start implementing the policy from next year, but we won't be, for the first 9-month period, we're kind of allowing this bedding in period. So we won't be monitoring for compliance, we won't be taking any actions related to non-compliance. But we will be interested in how implementation is going and how our policy is working and all of those things as well. So next slide, please. Also, just to say that we are sort of continually updating our website with guidance and resources. We've worked with colleagues internally and externally. We've developed resources and guidance for authors and their organisations to follow the policies. And some of these have been published on our website and also recently updated, and we've provided some links there. And as I say, these slides will be made available afterwards, so you can look at our further information, guidance and resources on our website. Next slide, please. And now I'm handing over to Tahir.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'll be talking about the open access funding that we are providing. So to support our policy aims, UKRI is providing a £3.5 million dedicated fund per annum. But to support the open access to these outputs, the fund is only for long-form publications that are in scope of the open access policy. And it is only to be used for publications where the version of record is going to be published open access immediately with a Creative Commons license. So there's a slight nuance there. So while our policy accepts is completely agnostic to routes and allows a 12-month maximum 12-month embargo, when it comes to our funding, it must be immediately available open access, and it must be the version of record for the research organisation to access the fund. The fund will be centrally held by UKRI, so organisations must apply to UKRI to access it, and stage 1 for it opened yesterday on the 28th of November for stage 1 applications, and from January 2024 we will open stage 2 via the funding service. Next slide, please. We are introducing a 7-year threshold for our open access requirements. So as part of our stakeholder engagement during our development process and during our implementation process, we heard that publications, particularly monographs, book chapters, edited collections, these types of publications can arise many, many years after the end of a grant, and that they draw on multiple sources of research funding and sometimes private research as well. And that the further the researcher gets from the end of the UKRI funded research project, the less substantial the link between the output and the publication might be. So we've introduced a 7-year threshold for this, and we consider this a reasonable time based on the data and evidence that we've got. So this means that if a monograph, book chapter, or edited collection is published 7 or more years after the formal end of a UKRI funded grant or a UKRI funded project, then it is no longer eligible for support via this dedicated fund that we are providing, and therefore we do not expect that publication should be published open access. There will be flexibility in this, so it's not completely rigid. We understand that there could be EDI issues. We understand that sometimes a publication might be submitted to the author, to the publisher by the author within that 7-year threshold, and it just takes a little bit longer for the publication to be produced because of the production timescale. So there will be flexibility for these types of extenuating circumstances. Next slide, please. Now, what can UKRI's Open Access Fund be used for? We are completely agnostic to the business model by which open access is achieved. We just ask that if you are using the fund, it must be for the immediate open access to the version of record with a Creative Commons license. We have introduced maximum funding levels to the publications, and these are in the table below on this slide. So for book processing charges and chapter processing charges, we will be providing maximum of £10,000 or £1,000 inclusive of VAT. And for diamond or non-book processing charge open access models, we're providing £6,000 plus £6,000 for the first output and an additional £3,000 if 2 or more publications from the same organisation are being published open access under that same collection. I think it's worth mentioning that the diamond or non-BPC models in the UK do not incur VAT, whereas book processing charges and chapter processing charges do so. I also want to point out that for monographs, book chapters and edited collections, for monographs and edited collections, we are allowing authors and their organisations to claim some additional funds when it comes to clearing rights for third-party materials if needed for publications. And this limit is inclusive of those above limits, so the 10,000, 1,000 and 6,000. Sorry, the 10,000 and the 6,000. So you can claim up to £2,000 from within those maximum limits to clear those rights. However, the primary mechanism by which we support costs for these is via grant applications, and it will continue to be via grant, permissible via research grants. We've just included this because we understand that sometimes an author might not realize the scale of the cost, or they may not realize how many third-party materials they need until it comes time, until they're writing their publication. Next slide, please. And now I believe I hand over to Emma on the two-stage process.
Thanks, Tahir. So to explain, you're probably quite aware by now that our funding process is going to does have two stages. So stage one is where the research organisation registers an output with UKRI for funding. And we process that application and confirm to the research organisation if the output is eligible. We get a lot of questions about what happens if something isn't eligible. And the main reasons why something would not be eligible would be it's either out of scope of the open access policy totally, or it's in scope of the open access policy for research articles, in which case it can be supported through our block grant that we provide to eligible organisations. And the reason that we have this two-stage process is so that at stage one, we can give the author and the research organisation some assurance before a legal contract is signed that the output is eligible to be supported by our ring-fence fund. The next stage is stage two, and that's the stage where you as the organisation supply evidence to us that the publication is available open access, and you provide some payment information to us. And we then process this information and release the funds to you. So the reason we have the stage two is so that you can provide final confirmation of publication to us so that we can release the funding. We'll go into it in a little bit more detail when we start going through the form. But as an organisation, you can collate multiple publications into a single stage one and a single stage two application if you choose to, but you don't have to. You can submit a single application for a single publication if that's what works better with your workflows. And something that we'd also like to highlight, that our process is trust-based. So we're not asking authors or their organisations to provide a statement on the link to UKRI funding. This was something that we did test in some early versions of the forms, but we've decided to remove that. So we're not asking organisations to provide that anymore. And we're considering the provision of the UKRI funding reference to be sufficient. So in terms of an indicative timeline for this process, as Tahir noted, stage one opened yesterday and is currently live. And we're aiming to open stage two for applications in mid-January 2024. The first payment against this particular funding scheme is going to be made in June 2024, and that will be as part of our normal quarterly pay run. Because of that, there will be a period where we'll have to prepare the grants and make those live. So there will be an indicative internal closing date at which we sort of draw a line and only process any applications received up to that date to meet that particular pay run. We're currently working with our colleagues in funding operations to confirm those dates, but we'll confirm those and publish them on the website as soon as we can. And then the next payment against this scheme, we're going to make two payments each year, and the next payment will be in the December 2024 pay run. And again, we'll have one of those internal closing dates by which we process everything received up to a particular date. And again, we'll share that on the website as soon as we've got that confirmed with our colleagues. And I think so just to give a sort of visual overview of how the funding process is going to work. So the process will start pre-stage one, and that's where the author who plans to publish a monograph, book chapter or edited collection that acknowledges UKRI funding liaises with their organisation and publisher to gather up all of the requisite information. And then following that, the research organisation will submit a stage one application on behalf of the author to UKRI via the web form, which we're going to go through in a moment. And I'll cover the numbers of applications, publications you can put in a single submission in a moment. So that submission comes through to us and we consider that and decide if the publication is eligible for support, and we'll communicate that decision via email. And then if something is not eligible, the process ends there. Potentially you can resubmit the same information again, should you need to. And what we'll aim to do is provide a little bit more detail about why something might not be eligible. But if something is eligible, you'd then move on to the pre-stage two, which is where the author writes and publishes their monograph, chapter or collection. And when the open access version is available, the author informs their research organisation that the publication is ready for you to submit a stage 2 application on their behalf. And they liaise with their organisation and publisher again to gather up that requisite information. The research organisation will then submit a stage 2 application to UKRI, and that will be via the funding service, or TFS, which is our new grants application and management system that is being rolled out across UKRI currently. And again, we process the application, review the information, we ensure that the publication was deemed eligible at stage 1 and there's a corresponding stage 1 submission, and we'll communicate that decision via email to the organisation, and then we will set up a grant to make that payment to you. And again, that will be done twice a year in our standard pay runs. And that's where the process ends. So if I just stop sharing for a moment, and
so thanks, Emma. Yeah, so we're going to move on to the demonstration of the citizen space process now. And I think, as Emma alluded to, just to mention that obviously this is a new process for UKRI, and we've kind of been evolving it and developing it and sort of communicating those changes to you. So as Emma says, there have been sort of some tweaks and one sort of key change, I think, to this process compared to the previous webinar that we did. So Emma will talk through those in more details. So just to highlight those. So Emma, are you ready to share?
Hopefully you should all be able to see my screen. So before I launch into taking you through the form step by step, just to explain that for stage 1, we're using something called Citizen Space, and that's a stakeholder engagement system that is very widely used across UKRI and wider government for lots of different purposes. And in UKRI, we use it a lot for things like stakeholder surveys. We've used it for recruitment, so for panel and college recruitment for grants. And we have also used it to gain outline information about potential applications for grant funding. So I think it's very recently been used for the new interdisciplinary responsive mode to gain that outline information. So we're using Citizen Space for stage 1 rather than TFS, which is the funding service. And that's mainly because TFS is at quite an early stage of development. It's being iteratively developed, but its main focus at the moment is UKRI's core business, which is grants. And we found from our early stakeholder engagement that a lot of the language that was used and the way some of the forms were set up wasn't particularly helpful for what we're trying to do for the stage 1 application for long form publications. So we decided to use this citizen space form instead, and we were able to build something that was a little bit more bespoke and have a little bit more help text on there as well, because we recognise that the people who might be filling this in are not the people who might be used to using things like TFS. So I'm sharing here a preview version of the citizen space form, and it's almost identical to the live environment. There are a couple of changes which I'll explain as we come across them. But this is what you'll see when you click on the link from our website, and it takes you to an overview page. And this is a page that you get before you actually click into the survey. And what we've tried to do here is provide lots of information about what this form is for and who should be using it. A couple of things just to point out. The form has a closing date of the 28th of November 2030. There is nothing significant about that date. We need a closing date to open the form. We've set it a sensible distance in the future. We can't set it much further because it starts to do crazy things. But 2030 is just simply so that we can open the form with a date on it. And you'll see across the form, there are lots of points where you can click on our web email address and send us an email. So there are lots of points in the form where you can ask us for help if you need to. If you get stuck or if anything doesn't make sense, simply click on the open research at ukri.org and it will open up your email and you can send an email to us and ask for help. So we've covered quite a bit of information on this overview page. Again, to make sure that it's the right people submitting this form to us, we are stressing and do stress a number of points in the form that we only want people from research organisations to submit this on behalf of authors. We don't want authors to complete the form themselves. And that's mainly, again, because of the stakeholder feedback that organisations want to be aware of what is being submitted in their name. It's also useful that authors have those conversations with you, particularly at this early stage. So again, we don't want authors submitting this form, and we've tried to build into the form a number of points where hopefully it will stop the wrong people submitting the form to us. So we've got some more information here about the two-stage application process. And you'll see lots and lots of links to our website and to our policy documents. So if there's anything that you're not sure about, you can click from the form into our policy for a bit more information. We've got some questions here, a question here about what publications are eligible. So we're talking about the type of publication, and also we've got a note here about the 7 years of the formal end date of the associated UKRI research funding. And again, we reiterate that a number of times across the form to make it really clear. Again, we've got a bit of information about this is not for open access costs for research articles, because we support those through our block grants to eligible research organisations. And again, you can click here to find out more information about publications that are in scope of the policy. And Annex 1 of the policy document is particularly useful in that respect. Again, we've got the question about who can apply. So we want applications from staff responsible for open access funding in UK-based research organisations, and authors should not complete this form. And what we've got here is a little note for those authors who are not currently based at a UK research organisation, and we're asking them to contact us directly. This is for those probably quite rare cases where an author is no longer at an organisation that we can pay. So they might have left academia, they might be working for a very small organisation that isn't registered to receive UKRI research funding, and it wouldn't necessarily be sensible to take them through that process. They might have left the UK, they might have retired. In those very rare cases, we may consider paying a publisher directly, but that would be because of those exceptional reasons and not because of author or publisher choice. We also note here that the research organisation making the submission doesn't need to be the submission where the research funding that's being acknowledged was originally held. So we've had lots of questions about what happens if authors move. That isn't a problem for us in terms of the applications. And if authors move between stage 1 and stage 2, again, it doesn't matter if a different organisation is submitting those different parts of the application. We really don't mind. Our main concern is that we don't want multiple stage 2 applications. But that would be a conversation you'd need to have with the author and perhaps with the other organisation to work out who is best placed to make the application, depending on where you are in the research life cycle. In terms of receiving a response from UKRI, we're aiming to provide confirmation within 10 working days of submission. That is subject to application volumes. If we get very high volumes of applications, it may take us a little bit longer. And again, we have the link to drop us an email if there's anything that isn't clear here. What you'll see across the form are these fact banks, these little drop downs, and we've put some more information here. So to answer some of the common questions that we've been getting about stage 1. So why are there 2 stages to the application process? So explaining that 2-stage process again. Do I need to submit both a stage 1 and a stage 2 in order to receive funding? And the answer is yes. You can't submit a stage 2 without having submitted a stage 1. But we also recognise that there is no minimum or maximum time between submitting a stage 1 and a stage 2. We recognise that it might be that you submit your stage 1 and you get the response and you submit a stage 2 quite soon after, particularly at the start of the launch of the funding. But in many cases, it might be that a stage 1 is submitted and there could be months or years between submitting the stage 2, and that's equally fine. The main limitation is going to be that stage 7-year threshold, which is from the end date of the UKRI funding, not from the date that you've submitted a stage 1 application. Another question that we'll cover again as we go through the form is how many publications can we register at once? And you can include up to 10 publications in each stage 1 submission, and you can make as many submissions as you need. There is no limit in any time period for any organisation. We're not saying that you can only make X number of submissions per however long. You're welcome to submit as many submissions as you need to. And we've also, a question that we've put here is about authors writing book series. Can we make a single submission for the whole series? No, you can't. You'll have to register each volume as a separate publication, but you could put all volumes in a single application if you wanted to. And then there's a couple of sort of housekeeping questions. So do I have to complete the form in one go? No, there is a save and return feature on the form. So you can save a partially completed form and return to it at a later date if you wanted to. But you should ensure that you've got cookies enabled on your browser and that you don't clear your cache if that's something that you do. And this is the section that I actually need to make a small update to. But when you submit the form, you will get an automated response email confirming that you've made a submission from this particular citizen space address and a unique reference number. And we ask you to make a note of that reference because you will need it if you're contacting UKRI about an application and when submitting a stage 2. We have a note here about before submitting the form, you'll have the option to request a PDF copy of the submission, which can be sent to a single email address. We've actually changed this so that you won't need to remember to do this stage, and I will update this in the guidance to show that it's been changed. But what will happen is when you get to the end of the form, you'll get the automated response email, which will have a link in it, which you can click on and download your PDF submission. So you don't need to put in another email address at the end of the form. You will get that link. It's not mandatory to download it, but we recommend that you do because that will give you a printout of everything that you've put in a particular submission. And I will tweak that just to reflect that change to the form. And then at the bottom of the form here, we've just got some links to some relevant pages on our website, which you can click on if you need to. I will also note that on our website, we have got a PDF version of this form. So you can see the layout of the form and you can see all of the questions without actually clicking into the survey. And we've also provided an Excel version of the publication questions page so that you can take that offline. You can share that with authors and they can give you that information before you put it into the actual submission. And that's linked from our website and that has gone live today. So what happens, the first thing you do is click on the form to register your publications with UKRI. And the first page it will take you into is an introduction page. And this is, again, one of the gates that we've built into the system to try and stop the wrong people submitting. And because we can't physically stop, we can't put any sort of validations on that, is that we're asking you to confirm at this point that you're responsible for open access at your research organisation and you're making this submission on behalf of an author from your organisation. If somebody clicks no to this, they will be taken to a page with a little bit more information that explains again that this form should only be completed by a member of a relevant team in a research organisation. And we some guidance for the authors that please contact the team responsible for open access funding at their research organisation who can submit the application on their behalf. And again, we've got that note about people who are no longer based at a UK research organisation. So just going back. But assuming that the right person is filling in this form, they would click yes and then continue. And that will take you into a page where you can, where we're asking you to provide some details about who is making this submission. And you'll only need to fill in this page once per submission. And again, we're really just trying to check here that we've got the right people submitting this form to us. So the first question is the name of the person submitting this form. And again, you've got the drop down with a little bit more information there. This doesn't have to be an individual. It could be a team name if you wanted. There is no validation on that. So that's fine if you just wanted to put the open access team or something like that. And again, another question, again, just to try and make sure it's the right person submitting this form, is the job title of the person making this submission to UKRI. And again, that can be a team name if that's easier for you, if you're going to fill in these forms on a team basis. The next question is a contact email address for the submission. And for the citizen space form, this can be a generic or team email address. So again, you can have this sent to a central inbox. We ask that you make sure that you use an address that is monitored because we will use this email address to contact you if there are any problems with the submission. And we're also asking that people use an institutional email, again, to just stop those submissions coming in from the Hotmail or the Gmail address and to make sure that they're coming from the right people. The next question is the name of the organisation. And again, we stress that it doesn't need to be the organisation where the research funding being acknowledged was originally held. And then we've got another question here, which is not a mandatory question, so you can leave this one blank, but it's asking for the organisational research organisation registry ID, if known. You can leave this blank. We recognise that not organisations have an ROR ID. We have put in a link to the ROR website, so you can look that up. But that's really just to help us for reporting. There are many different ways to write the same organisation name. So it just helps us make sure that we're getting linking things to the right organisation. You can see that if I try to click continue without filling in the mandatory fields, it will highlight them in red. And note that there are some errors with the submission, and it will tell you what the error is. So in this case, it actually needs a name in those boxes. But assuming that I'm the right person and I've filled everything in, I will then click continue. And that will take me into the page where I can put the details for the first publication. And this is the page that we've provided the Excel spreadsheet of all the questions for, so that you can share that offline if you need to. So this is where you put in the details for the first publication that you would like to register. And again, we note here that you can register more than one publication per submission, up to 10 publications. And the first question is, what type of publication are you registering? And these are radio buttons, so you have to pick one of them, either a monograph, an edited collection, or a book chapter. And you can see in the drop down that we've got some more information and a link to our policy where we have definitions of the different types of publications, which will be helpful. The next question is the UKRI funding reference. We've put in quite a lot of information here to try and address some of the questions that we had, particularly during the stakeholder testing. So what we're asking for here is the author's UKRI funding reference for the research funding which the publication will be acknowledging. And in most cases, this will be a grant reference, which is typically written in this format. So you have the suffix denoting the council and then the number string after that. And grants can be research grants, fellowships, or training grants, which are the vehicle that we through which we provide most of our PhD funding. And they're normally in the form of doctoral training partnerships, DTPs, or centres for doctoral training, CDTs. But you do get the odd student who is funded as part of a research grant. So that's something that's worth checking when you're making the submission. We note here that if a publication is acknowledging multiple UKRI grant references, you only need to enter one grant reference in the form, and we recommend that you should enter the grant reference for the grant with the latest or most recent end date, because that is when we'll be counting the 7-year threshold from. And again, we've got this notification that you can submit a stage 1 application at any time, but funding will only be provided if the publication occurs within 7 years of the formal end date of the UKRI funding that's being acknowledged. We've got a little bit of information here for people who are submitting details for publications that are arising from units, centres, or institutes that get core funding from UKRI. And noting here that you shouldn't include any grant references from other funders. And if you're unsure about whether a reference is for UKRI funding, then you can check on Gateway to Research, and we've put the link there for you. Gateway to Research has the details for the majority of UKRI funding, but if it's not there, then you're welcome to contact us directly at openresearch@ukri.org, and we can look into that for you. The next question is the end date of UKRI funding. So enter the end date of the UKRI research funding that's being referenced in the previous question. We recognise that some people will be acknowledging grants that haven't yet ended, so you should enter the current planned end date of the award. And it is absolutely fine if that changes between stage 1 and stage 2. We recognise that grants change, grants get extended, suspended, all sorts of things, that's fine. And for PhD students, we want the end date, the date of PhD award, not the date of the grant through which they are funded, because most of the grants are CDTs and DTPs, which are large, multi-cohort, multi-year grants, which last for much longer than each individual student's funding. So it will be the date of PhD award for that individual student. And again, where the PhD hasn't yet been awarded, you should enter the current estimated award date. We do have a validation on this section that you can't enter any funding end dates that are before, I think, the 1st of January 2017. If that is a problem, then please do just drop us an email. We recognise there might be some issues for EDI reasons why we might need to extend that 7-year threshold. The next question is author names. So we're asking for the names of the lead authors and any authors that are associated with the relevant UKRI research that led to the output. And where you're putting multiple author names in, please separate those with a semicolon. There is a text limit of 100 characters on this field, and we don't anticipate that will be a problem, but if we start to see any issues, do please let us know and we can raise that limit. The next question is asking for the author's ORCID. If no, you can see this isn't a mandatory question, so if you don't know it, that's fine, but if you do know it, please enter it in. It's really helpful for us in terms of reporting. And again, separating each ORCID with a semicolon if necessary. The next question is the title of the publication, which should be the title of the monograph, edited collection or book chapter that you're registering with UKRI. And it is not a problem if the title provided for the stage 1 application is a draft. If it changes between stage 1 and stage 2, that's fine. And again, there's a limit of 200 characters on this particular field, which we don't anticipate would be a problem, but we can change if necessary. The next 2 questions are questions that are only need to be completed if you're providing details for a book chapter. And again, you can see that neither of these questions are mandatory. So it won't be a problem to move through the form if you don't fill these in. We want to know the name of the editors of the collection where the chapter will be published. And again, noting you don't need to complete this section if you're registering a monograph or whole edited collection. And the next question is the title of the edited collection where the chapter will be published. And again, just noting that you don't need to complete this section if you're registering a monograph or a whole edited collection. The next question is the name of publisher. This is a required field. If the publisher is not confirmed, then you can write unknown in this field and that will be fine. But we do recommend that authors consult with a publisher before the stage 1 submission is made. And that's to ensure that the chosen publisher offers a publishing option that's going to be compliant with our policy and eligible for UKRI funding. So it's really helpful if the author has those conversations before you submit a stage 1 application. The next question is not mandatory, but again, helpful. If you know it, please can you put in the publisher's research organisation registry ID? Again, not mandatory. The next question are the estimated open access costs that you're going to be requesting from UKRI. So we've put some information here again about our maximum contributions. When you put information in this field, please ensure that it's inclusive of VAT where VAT applies. An estimate should be given in £. And where possible, you should base that figure on a quote or cost information from the intended publisher that you're considering using. And again, we've got some more information here about the maximum contributions and a link to our website so that you can find out some more information if you need to. The next question is the anticipated date of publication. And that's the estimated date that the publication will be available open access. And we recognise that when you're submitting the stage 1 form, you may not know that date for sure, and particularly the day. And so you're welcome to put 01 for the day if that's not yet known. And we just want to stress here that any date you provide here is not considered a due date or a deadline for publication, or a date by which you must submit a stage 2 application. If that changes between stage 1 and stage 2, that is fine, but it's very useful for us to have at this point an indication of when a publication is likely to be made and when you're likely to be putting in that stage 2 application for funds from UKRI. But again, you've got the note about the 7-year threshold. And again, noting that we are counting 7 years from the formal end date of a project or the UKRI funding and not from the date that you submit this stage 1 form. And then we just have 2 questions that are, again, helpful to us for tracking, particularly when authors have moved organisation. So it's asking, are you the grant holding organisation for the UKRI grant that this publication acknowledges, grant or funding? And again, it doesn't affect eligibility of the publication to be supported by the ring-fence fund. If you answer yes or no, it simply allows us to trace, particularly when authors have moved. And if you put no, we're just asking that you put in the name of the grant holding organisation. Again, that's just useful for us for tracking grants and understanding why an organisation A might be submitting details for a grant that was originally held at organisation B. So once you've completed that form, you would click continue, and that will take you to a page that will ask you if you want to add details for another publication, and you can choose yes or no. If you click yes, then it will take you onto the page for publication 2, and so on, up to 10 publications in total. But if you click no, that will take you to our almost done page, which notifies you that you're about to submit your response and covers the information that by submitting your response you allow us to analyse the information that you provided. This is actually looks slightly different in the live form. This field doesn't exist. You won't be asked to put in an email address. What it will say here is that once you click submit, you'll be sent a confirmation of submission, which will have a link in it that you can click on to get the PDF version of your submission. So you don't need to put in any more details here. Once you've done all that, you can submit your response, and you'll get an automated a page that tells you that your response has been submitted. This will give you your response ID, and it's useful if you make a note of this, but you will get that in your automated response email as well, and in any emails from us. And that's just the address that it will come from. So it might be worth, if it doesn't come through within a couple of minutes, it's worth checking your junk email. Yeah, and then we will consider your application, and then within the 10 working days, we will get back to you about whether the publications that you've submitted are eligible for funding or not. So that's the form. I will stop sharing. There we go.
Thanks very much for that, Emma. That was brilliant. So we're going to move to Q&A now, and so try and answer in those between myself, Tahir, and Emma. There are a few questions in the Q&A already, so I don't know, Tahir or Emma, do you want to kick off in sort of sorting through those?
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you, Emma. So we've got one here. Are there any circumstances whereby an application might be approved as eligible at stage 1, but is then refused at stage 2? So the short answer is yes, it is possible that might happen, but it would only be, for example, where the UKRI funded author is no longer part of that publication. So, for example, you have an edited collection and the UKRI funded author was a co-editor on that collection. Something happened and that editor is no longer involved. That means that publication is no longer in scope of the policy because the author does not need to acknowledge UKRI funding. So it's only in those sorts of cases that it would be refused. So it's no longer in scope. And the only other time that could happen would be if the 7-year threshold has been surpassed and no extenuating circumstances apply.
Yeah, there potentially could be a case where the nature of the publication has changed so much between the point where you've submitted a stage 1 and stage 2 that it's out of scope of the policy. But in those cases, we'd expect that you'd be aware and you simply wouldn't make the stage 2 application. And that's fine. If you're not able to make a stage 2 from making a stage 1, that's fine. That's not a problem. We've had a question about, does the 7 years extend back to 2017 or just forward from 2024? So it's back to 2017. It's 7 years from the start date of the policy, which is the 1st of January 2024. Sorry, I've completely. We've had another question about when UKRI supplies reassurance to the HEI at stage 1, will we get a grant award letter? This would help us with our finance processes when making a payment and potentially carrying it over financial years. So no, you won't get an award letter at stage 1 because we're not managing this through our grant system. You will get an award letter at stage 2. But what we'll be doing is making a single payment following stage 2. That's probably something I should have mentioned, didn't mention in the presentation, is that if you submit multiple stage 2 applications during a payment period, what we will do is bundle those up into a single payment so that you're not having to manage multiple grants.
We've got one for Sarah, actually. Oh gosh, sorry, there's so many questions coming in, it changed. So for a conference paper in proceedings with an ISBN, is that classed as a book chapter or is it no longer in scope of the policy?
Yeah, so for conference proceedings, we recognise that the policy is a little bit unclear on that. So it could be sort of interpreted that those with an ISBN currently fall within the long form policy. But we are hoping to look at that as part of our, we're doing a sort of in-flight review of our research articles policy at the moment. So in April next year, the research articles policy will have been running for 2 years, and we're kind of looking at how that implementation is going, and the sort of clarity around conference proceedings and being needing to be clearer on that and where that sits in the policy is one of the issues that we're going to address in that. So we're hoping to provide a bit more clarity on where that sits in the policy in the near future.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
We've had a question for collaborative PhDs, e.g. between an IRO and HEI, which organisations should apply for the funding? We don't have any preference. We would suggest it should be the organisation that is supporting the author to make the publication, but whichever it is, it isn't an issue for us. That would be something you need to decide for yourselves.
Sorry, can I just come in on that? When I saw that question, I thought the acronym IRO meant International Research Organisation. So if you are working with an international organisation, it must be the UK-based research organisation that applies to the fund. We can only pay UK-based research organisations. Yes,
if it's a UK-based independent research organisation, then that is fine.
So many acronyms in the world of open research.
Another question we've had is, if an author manages to ignore the checks you've put in place, i.e. they still submit in their name, will you reject the application? If we see anything that is unusual and doesn't quite make sense to us, we will contact that person and make sure that they are someone who should be submitting that application. And we will ask them to speak to the relevant team at their organisation and resubmit on their behalf. So we're not formally rejecting anything at this stage, but we would ask them to make sure the right people make their application for them.
Thank you. We've got one that might be for both Sarah and Emma, actually. Do you want a specific format for author names, forename or surname first, including titles, doctor, professor, etc.? I'm asking Sarah because I know that you're working on the monitoring and evaluation, and it might come up with the bibliographic data. So let's start with Sarah and then go to Emma.
From my point of view, no. I think if we can have the ORCIDs, that's very useful for monitoring and evaluation. But Emma, I don't know if you...
We don't have any preference. Because we're asking for multiple authors in the single field, we can't set up a validation to get the information in a specific format. So it's whatever format works best for you and fits within the character limit. So that's absolutely fine for us. Another question we've had is, in terms of ensuring authors don't use the form to submit, would it be helpful for UKRI to have a list of name contacts from HEIs? Possibly not, simply because people change jobs so quickly, so the list would go out of date quite quickly, so it probably wouldn't be much use to us. We are hoping that we've put enough barriers in that the form won't make sense if somebody is trying to submit. We probably will see a few submissions from authors, but we will try and address those as they come in.
We have a question. If a publication is approved for funding but publication is slow, then will the 7-year threshold not apply? The 7-year threshold will continue to apply. If the publication is simply slow because of, for example, career breaks, or because the production on the publisher's end just took a little bit longer than expected, the 7-year threshold still applies, but we would just ask that you get in touch with us and let us know that those extenuating circumstances have affected the timescales for publishing that monograph, edited collection, or chapter. I
think we've had a question. What happens if you lose the reference number? Will you have an account you can look at to see previous applications, or is it gone? So because you don't have to log into Citizen Space, There's nothing that you can log into to find the number. If you lose it, you can contact us though, because we will have a record of all of the submissions that are made, so we can give you that number. And if, for example, you have an authors moved organisation and perhaps you're a different organisation to the one that made the stage 1, we can help you with that number as well in those cases.
I've got one for Sarah, I believe. Is the UKRI fund capped? I think this means the total, the 3.5 million per annum that we've allocated. If yes, what would happen if demand exceeds the available funding?
So we're not envisaging a competition. There's no competition for this fund. So we are kind of honouring those applications that are being sent in will be funded. We are obviously going to keep an eye and monitor this very closely. And if there is a case for it, we will provide more funding. So yeah, there's no need to sort of worry about competition and the money running out. But we are keeping an eye on it, obviously.
Thank you.
So we've had a question, can we get the end date of the UKRI from GTR? UKRI award from GTR? Yes, you can. GTR is almost live, so I think it updates every 6 weeks or so. So it will have the current end date of the funding if the award is live, or the actual end date if the award has closed. So yeah, you can get that from there.
We've got a few questions from different people on the same topic. What happens if stage 1 costs are, if at stage 1 the costs for the open access publication are known to be higher than the maximum funding that UKRI will provide for the publication, and the self-archiving route is not possible? Will authors still be required to comply with the policy? Yes, authors are still required to comply with the policy. We have some permitted exemptions within our policy, but they are not permitted on the basis of a publisher's open access costs being higher than what UKRI is going to pay. So we have updated our frequently asked questions, and we provide some guidance on how research organizations could manage those conversations with researchers when that would happen. But in short, what we say is that we will be paying up to our maximum funding limit. So for example, if you have a quote for £12,000 inclusive of VAT, we can give you up to the £10,000 inclusive of VAT for a book processing charge, but we will not be paying more than that. And what we would expect research organizations to do is to check with their publisher if they're able to adjust fees or offer a discount on that basis, that the UKRI will only provide up to the £10,000 limit for book processing charges. We would also recommend checking if there are institutional funds that are available, or potentially seeking an alternative publisher if no other option is available. But there is no specific exemption if a publisher's cost exceed UKRI's maximum limits.
Thanks to hear. We've had a question for date of publication. Are all elements of the date required, day, month, year, or can just the year be entered? It does require all elements, but you are welcome to put 01 for the day and then take a guess at the best month. Like we said, it doesn't need to be accurate at this point. Just a general indication is helpful to us. Another question is, please can you confirm if there is always a grant reference associated with training grants? Often authors say there isn't a grant number, or they give their student number. Is that correct? And we should find out the high level grant number. This has only come up so far in relation to articles, but anticipate it may arise in relation to books too. So I think I might actually tweak the guidance on that you can use the grant reference or the studentship reference, whichever would be easier. We can track either of those. And I think both of those are on GTR as well. So yeah, you could use either.
We've got a question. Is there a mechanism for withdrawing a stage 1 application? For example, if the proposed publisher goes bust, should we just send you an email? Emma, I think you can come in on that.
So there's no formal mechanism as such. If the proposed publisher goes bust, but the intention is still to publish, you can still just submit your stage 2 and put the name of the new publisher in at stage 2. We are anticipating that for the stage 2 form, there will be somewhere where you can note if there have been any significant changes between stage 1 and stage 2. So you could tell us about a publisher. If for whatever reason the book is no longer going to be published, again, that's fine. You just don't submit a stage 2.
Yeah, there's no requirement to submit a stage 2 or notify us. We'll probably be able to monitor that from when we see something doesn't appear at stage 2 eventually. There's a question related to the form. Could it make sense to make the name of publisher field a drop-down menu? Sherpa book entries could be useful for that. For example, some publishers acquire others. I don't know if the form can support that, but I'll leave Emma to do that. But I wonder if that would affect how the data might come up in terms of how this might affect bibliographic data, because we do know that there are several publishers that operate essentially as conglomerates, as they have multiple imprints of smaller publishing houses, and authors may not always appreciate that these are owned. So there would be some risk of confusion if, for example, the niche publisher you thought that you were publishing with is not listed in that drop down.
Yeah, I think in theory we can do it on the form, but it would have to be manually updated because the form isn't pulling information from anywhere. And we wouldn't want to, just have a few and then other and practically everything coming in other. That wouldn't be particularly useful, but it's definitely something we can consider for further development of the form. Yeah.
We've got some questions on third-party rights and clearing these. And how does an institution request the funds for copyright permissions? So you don't need to do that at stage 1. At stage 1, all we're asking you to do is register the output, and we will be providing further guidance on how to do this at stage 2. When stage 2 goes live.
Yeah, and the intention is to hopefully do something similar to this for stage 2. So have 1 or 2 webinars where we can take people through the stage 2 form in detail, so that again we can provide the same level of information for that stage as well.
Is it also worth saying that they can be included in the grant application still as well? Yeah.
Yes, that is the primary mechanism by which through which UKRI as an organisation supports access to third-party materials. So that continues to be the case, and the grant and the open access fund that we're providing is only where those grants have not been sufficient, essentially, or the author hadn't anticipated requiring that many third-party materials. I've got a question for Sarah. Some authors will cite an intended output and publisher within a prospective UKRI grant. Will UKRI support the costs of this publication if the grant is successful?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question.
Some authors will cite an intended output and publisher within a prospective UKRI grant. Will UKRI support the costs of this publication if the grant is successful? My interpretation of the question, my interpretation is that the author is in the grant application is saying that I have an intended output with this publisher. So yes, we would support that. But I think it's worth pointing out that in the past, UKRI has supported open access costs for monographs and edited collections via grant funds. It is no longer possible to do that because we are providing the central fund. So if in the past you have an author and if you have an author in your research organization that has requested these open access costs as part of the grant application and they were awarded them, they should first use those grant funds that they were awarded for this purpose before coming to you as their research organization to seek open access funds via the dedicated fund. There's a lot of funds in that. We need to find a different way of saying fund without saying fund.
I think it's worth noting that if you're citing an output and publisher in a grant, if the grant is successful, you will still need to make a stage 1 application. So it doesn't override the need to make a stage 1. They're completely separate, so you still will need to do that. We've had a question, will there be any routing of notifications of awards via GES? Yes, potentially, depending on which system we actually make the awards through. So we're still at that transitional stage at the moment where we're moving from GES to TFS. So it may be that the notifications come through GES initially, but eventually they will all be through TFS.
This might be a one for Sarah. Where will the responsibility for open access rest if a researcher leaves their higher education institution within the 7-year window of which the research grant was held and completed, but the publication arises after they've moved organizations?
So in terms of the sort of policy, I mean, strictly the terms and conditions are with the grant, you know, with the research organisation, and they have the responsibility to make any publications of that open access, because our terms and conditions are with research organisations, not individuals. I think in terms of this long form funding, if that author wanted to make that publication open access, I think that would be a conversation between the author and their old research organisation, or we do have processes set up for authors that aren't affiliated with an organisation. And I think the guidance is to get in touch with us, Emma, in that circumstance. Yeah. So in that circumstance, we are setting up processes and kind of recognise that because of the nature of these long form publications, that authors might have moved on and they might not be affiliated with an organisation.
Thanks, Sarah. We've had a question. When you say there may be institutional funds available that could cover a shortfall in funding due to the cost being above the funding caps, would these institutional funds include the UKRI Open Access Block Grant? The short answer to that is no. The block grant is provided to support the implementation and compliance with the policy for research articles, not long form publications. So they are separate funding streams with separate purposes.
We've got a question here. Many higher education institutions have agreed read and publish deals with publishers. Will UKRI check whether long form outputs are included in these deals as part of stage 1 approval? We will not be asking for this information at stage 1, and we will provide guidance on any information that we are seeking at stage 2. However, we're not actually aware of any read and publish deals that include monographs, book chapters, or edited collections. So I'd say if your organization is party to such an agreement that does include these publication types, then please do get in touch with us. If, however, by read and publish deals, you actually mean the non-BPC type models that exist, and some of these are provided, some of these are on the basis of purchasing existing collections with a publisher, then we do provide specific guidance on how you can use UKRI's fund to pay towards these models in our guidance. And we have an information pack that has a dedicated slide on this as well. And Sarah, I wonder if you wanted to come in at all on that.
I think that's fine to hear. I think hopefully we've understood the issue there. If you think that we haven't, then please just get in touch with the team address, and if there's something that you think that we're missing there that we need to take account of, please do get in touch. Yeah, I'm just thinking of timing, so if there's maybe last couple of questions.
Yeah, so we've had a question. Can we have an example of a submission returned by Citizen Space so that we can work on developing processes for collecting the information in our own systems? So we have provided an Excel version of the questions on the publication page. In terms of how the information is returned to Citizen Space, it is in Excel format. So it's very basic CSV linear information. If you want to drop an email to openresearch@ukri.org with a bit more detail, I can look into that further, see if there's anything more helpful that we can provide.
So we've got a question. Sorry. If you are not asking for a statement about the link to UKRI funding, so UKRI will not decide if it's sufficiently linked or not, This seems to move responsibility onto people in institutions supporting researchers to make this decision. We are not asking researchers based in officers based in research organizations to make that decision. We are doing it entirely on a trust basis. So for us, having a UKRI grant reference that you are submitting to us at stage 1 is sufficient. We are no longer asking for a statement, and we are not asking the research organization to do any extra work to establish a link between the author and UKRI funding and the publication and the UKRI funding. Emma, Sarah, I wonder if you wanted to come in on that.
I think that's fine to hear. I think we have considered this point. Obviously, we did have something in our previous process, and we have considered it and listened to feedback from people. And I think one of the other point is that that's not something that we do for research articles. It is on a trust base for our research articles, so why not do the same for our long form? And it's just part of the it's a research integrity issue. It's part of the research process that we trust that authors know when to acknowledge their funding, and that's the kind of mechanism that we use to apply the policy. So if the research publication acknowledges our funding, then it falls in scope of the policy, and that's the kind of the process, business as usual sort of funding and funding acknowledgement and research process that we're relying on that happens already in research organisations.
Yeah. I think we've had a question. If an academic is at a small mainly learning and teaching institute and there's no direct staff for research support, will the academic be able to complete the form, or do all institutes need to have one specific personal team to do that? In those cases, the author could complete the form. We probably would get in touch and just double check and see what the situation is there. What I would flag is that for stage 2, because that's through TFS, the form will have to be completed by someone with a TFS account. But we'll provide more details on that when we launch stage 2.
There's a question here. If an author is paid a commission for publishing a monograph, should this be used to pay for open access? I think you're asking if they are expected to use the funds that they were paid by the publisher to pay the publisher's invoice. I don't think so. If the publication is in scope of the policy, then it is eligible to be supported via our fund. So we would be supporting that, provided that it meets the requirements of our policy and our fund.
Yeah, I think that's right here. Yeah. Are there any sort of last questions? I'm just aware of time, and I think we've done sort of 30 minutes-ish of Q&A. So
we do still have questions, but what we will do is that we will take all of the unanswered questions that we've got, and we'll put them into a summary, and we will publish those on our website alongside the recording of this webinar. We will do this. We're doing the same with any unanswered questions from the last webinar that we did on 23rd of November as well.
That's great. Okay, so I think then we will close the webinar there and just thank everyone for attending, and your questions. It was really useful for us as well to see what's on your mind. So hopefully you found this useful, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.